Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Monday, 11th September. It will be cloudy with highs of 19 degrees Celsius or 66 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:20 a.m. and sunset at 7:15 p.m. We are on the 42nd day of the Warsaw Uprising and a lot is happening on the ground, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a fair few things happening on the ground. I'm going to start with Śródmieście, so the Midtown district. Basically, the Germans are breaking into various different houses. This one, they break into on Ulica Bracka, which is more or less, it is in the Midtown, but it's in the southernish part of the Midtown district. It's not far from the barricade on Jerusalem Avenue, Aleja Jerozolimska. So they've broken into the buildings on the street. They damaged the guns that are within the building, but then the insurgents managed to drive them out. So again, this is a very repetitive thing, that it's going from house to house and building to building and floor to floor and room to room. So this battle is literally becoming really, really intense. And then the insurgents managed to recover a few more houses at the end of the street by noon. So they'd been fighting all morning up until the early afternoon. They continue fighting on surrounding streets. They're counterattacks by insurgent troops. They are losing one house and gaining another, and then losing another house and then gaining a different one. It is a constant back and forth and back and forth. The Germans are attacking from the Saski Gardens, where the Saski Palace stands there now but doesn't stand anymore. There's currently excavation processes going for the Saski Palace, and that's also where the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is. They fail. So the Germans' attack on those areas, they've failed. They're being very well defended for now. The Germans then also begin the next operations aimed at Czerniaków in the just south of Powiśle. So we've had, again, just to remind you all, the Old Town district has fallen, Powiśle has fallen, and now Czerniaków, which is south of Powiśle. So the Germans are moving inch by inch by inch and taking over as many districts as possible. So how is this being attacked? Well, typical, normal, we know this routine. They are hit by massive artillery fire. They're also hit by constant bombings, and this lasts all morning. So that whole area is being completely and utterly targeted. Tanks have also been deployed into the area, and they significantly damage a couple of buildings. But one of the platoon commanders is actually in one of those buildings. They end up staying on the ground floor and in the basements and still manage to repel these constant waves of attack. And then finally at night, the ones who survived that attack, they leave the building and move on to the next one. The Goliath is back. One of the barricades is completely destroyed by the explosion, and then the Germans manage to take over that area. And also in the same area, the German Luftwaffe are bombing several churches and half a dozen hospitals. So this wave of destruction is continuing by the Germans. But Claire, where are we with these capitulation terms? Because we keep coming back to this subject. Where are we and what is happening?
So, well, yesterday we were talking about the Polish Home Army sending capitulation terms to the German military authorities. Essentially, they were really playing for time at this point. But today, on the 11th, the Germans come back to them. So this is a message straight back from von den Bach, of course, is the commanding general for the Germans of the Warsaw area, Obergruppenführer and the police general. And he writes to the Home Army Command, but also more broadly to the people of Warsaw generally. And he provides what he calls written assurances. So, for example, he guarantees that members of the Home Army will have the full rights of a fighting army. This is obviously referencing the fact that the Home Army is now considered a legally recognised part of the Allied armed forces. So he's taken that into consideration, so he says. And he then goes on to say the civilian population will continue to be evacuated west, which sounds very anodyne. Of course, what that really means is they're being sent to labour camps so the Germans can take whatever benefit they can from the Polish civilian population. And a number of them are being shot as well. But he says that they'll be evacuated west. And he goes on to say, with a sort of sense of pride here, I think, he says, These types of assurances from the German side appear for the first time in the history of the world. They are given only because we want them to save the blood of a politically immature youth who've been brought to the fight. So this is him sort of saying, noblesse oblige, that we have all this authority. And, in the history of the world, Germany takes its rightful place and is being benevolent. And he's clearly placing the blame on the Polish leadership, General Bohr himself and the head of the Home Army. And for the record, he goes on to say, for the last time, it is stated clearly that the command of the German troops fighting in Warsaw has done everything to put an end to this madness, as if they hadn't started this madness by invading and occupying a peaceful neighbour and then violently, very brutally attacking their capital city and massacring many residents, particularly in the Wola and Oschata areas. And then that's the end of his carrots, his nice guy stuff. He goes on to say, this is the stick, the German military will now ruthlessly strive to end this fight. I think that is probably the only part of this communication that you can take literally as a truth. But of course, the Poles themselves, at this point, they've been playing for time yesterday and starting this dialogue, but now they break off capitulation talks. They don't trust von der Bach very reasonably, but also their attempt to play for time is working. So first of all, they don't think that this is sufficient guarantees from their enemy, but they've also got now promises of greater assistance coming from both the Western allies and from the Soviet troops who are starting to attack Praga in the outskirts of Warsaw itself. So this is what's encouraging them to continue the fight. How do the Germans respond to that? Roger, you've been looking into that side.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And just sort of piggybacking on what you're saying about German attitudes, because there's an article published on the 11th of September in 1944 in the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, which gives a sort of, I suppose, a view of the wider German opinion on all of this. And it's one mistake that it makes is that it seems to assume that the fighting in Warsaw is over, and it's probably that the journalist is kind of riffing on the fact that capitulation talks are underway, or contacts at least have been made, and obviously German victory at some point, obvious to a German mind at least, is inevitable. So it does kind of work on the assumption that the fighting has already ended. So, but it's quite instructive in other ways as well, particularly in the way it sort of outlines German thinking. So it opens up by actually sort of making various excuses for how long it's taken the Germans to subdue Warsaw, and how much cost it's taken in blood and material and so on. It says that this was not a favourable area for an uprising, but Warsaw is Warsaw and Warsaw is Poland, it says. And then by way of excuse, it says the insurgents were perfectly trained, they had a lot of ammunition, which incidentally they didn't, a long-developed plan, again questionable, fanaticism, and finally there are a lot of houses with an underground network of basements and catacombs, and they were animated by the promise of help from their London commanders. So again, command is, the connection to London is seen as being the sort of, the spider in the web, as it were, pulling the strings. It ends with, again, it's rather sort of chilling in a way, but it says that the uprising ended. Again, it gives it in the past tense. The uprising ended with a German victory, won by our troops fighting in cold blood, it says. Not only was Warsaw burned down and house after house and street after street destroyed, but a significant proportion of the Polish national wealth was destroyed. And it's hard to read from that as to whether it's sort of praising that prospect, or if it's stating that as a sort of regrettable side effect of the war. It could very easily be either way. My suspicion is it's probably the former, because as you sort of alluded to with your passage just now, Claire, a lot of what you see in terms of official German utterances during the war, with regard to the Poles particularly, is this attitude that these people are so inferior to us. How dare they rise up? How dare they strike us in that way? It's a really quite peculiar attitude, but you see it comes out in a lot of the messaging and the propaganda and sort of public and private messaging. And it's right there in 1939, incidentally. So it's there right from the beginning. I think you can see that here as well. So it's really interesting outline of contemporary German opinion on this.
I mean, it's so fascinating, isn't it, how the lack of the breakdown in communications and the breakdown of human empathy, and how completely diametrically opposed they are. I mean, the word that jumps out at me in this German communication is how they blame the Polish insurgents of fanaticism. They are defending their own capital. against an enemy onslaught, a very brutal one. And if we think of Nazis, what do we think? We think fanaticism. And so the fact that they don't see it in those terms, that is presented as a reasonable bit of, a public national press article. It's just fascinating.
I mean, that, to be fair, that sort of, as you say, I suppose, dehumanisation. I know you didn't use that word, I don't think, but essentially that's the sentiment. I've always found most interesting is that is there in 1939. So I think there's this assumption very often, particularly in the English-speaking narrative of all of this, that there's a sort of galloping barbarisation of warfare in World War II, that things gradually get worse and worse and more barbaric, as if, at the beginning it was reasonably chivalrous, but it absolutely wasn't. Certainly not in the East. That racial element is there from the outset, and that element of dehumanisation is there from the outset. So these are not sort of outliers. These are not, this is not just the inevitable product of 5 years of warfare. This was the attitude that the Germans had when they went in 1939.
I just want to add one more thing. I find it really interesting that they've used the words, there were a lot of houses with underground networks of basements and catacombs. Is this most likely because when they entered the Old Town, that's what they found? Because it's the only way that people could move about, really, with civilians and insurgents. They seem to assume that this is all the way throughout the whole of Warsaw.
Yeah, presumably. I think you're right. They've sort of extrapolated from the experience that what they saw in the Old Town when the Old Town capitulated, and extrapolated across. And of course, that's another of these exculpatory factors. So it's not our fault. It's not that we didn't do anything wrong. Our troops aren't rubbish. It's because of all of these factors, and that's one of them, that they had this underground network. So I think you're absolutely right there.
And thank you so much for joining us for day 42 of the Warsaw Uprising podcast, and we will see you tomorrow for day 43. Just a reminder, if you like us, do go rate us on your favourite listening platform. We do need those ratings so more people can see us. And again, America, what is happening? Why have I got so many Brits listening rather than Americans? Spread it amongst all your American friends. We've got some good American content coming up in the next couple of days, so stay tuned for that.